welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Egypt is asserting national independence and a perspective for the future for the first time in decades. As you know, if you followed this program since early 2011, I have been hoping and looking for Nasserist officers in the Egyptian military and Nasserist officials in the Egyptian bureaucracy who could save Egypt from the chaos of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, of course, a destabilization against all the Arab, North African, Middle East, and Islamic countries broadly. The Arab Spring was designed to destabilize all those countries and destroy them, to reduce them to mini-states, micro-states, failed states, rump states, warlords, civil wars, secessions, and so forth. And we see that the countries where the military was relatively weak, such as Tunisia and Libya, are the countries where the destabilization has succeeded most. Any fool ought to see that there has been a worldwide alliance between the Moslem Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and the CIA for the last several years at the very least, and actually going back to the 1950s, or with the British back to the 1920s. The British founded the Moslem Brotherhood to keep Egypt under their control by making nationalism impossible. So nationalism and national dignity are returning to Egypt. And what we're also seeing is the impotence of the United States. The empire is in a process of decline. We welcome the decline of empire. Empire is not good for us Americans. It means real wages have been falling. Dictatorship, totalitarian measures have been multiplying. We don't need an empire. We can be more prosperous and indeed more powerful on the basis of a New Deal economy with a New Deal good neighbor policy, not universal imperialist meddling. So we've had the events in Egypt. Let me just jump ahead to some of our stories today. We want to tell you about the magnificent effort being mounted by the United Front Against Austerity, volunteers coming from the UFAA, participating in New York City in the elections. The Tax Wall Street Party has every reason to push ahead now in the last couple of days before August 20th. August 20th is the deadline for the signatures for the November election. It seems that the Tax Wall Street Party has every hope of getting on the ballot. But, of course, we're alert to chicanery, right, having been burned by this in New York State over many years. So the UFAA, we're also continuing our campaign to stop Robert Ford, the death squad expert, the harbinger of death squads. Historically, when Robert Ford shows up, the death squads are not far behind. This is the Negroponte school. These are no longer your State Department Arabists, but your State Department anti-Arabists. Ford must not become U.S. ambassador to Egypt. And indeed, I would think the way the wind is blowing right now, he's likely to be PNG'd, persona non grata. Why do I say this? As one of the signs of the increased independence, these stupid Americans have got to get it out of their head that the Egyptian army can be bought for paltry $1.5 billion, or is it $1.3 billion? They don't need your $1.3 billion. They've got $12 billion that they've extorted from the Saudis. And this is not that the Saudis control them. This is pure fear on the part of the Saudis. They're paying protection money. They're hoping that it doesn't come to visit them in the Gulf states. So those Egyptian officers are more and more independent. When the amigos were there, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, right, used to meddling and pontificating. They went into northern Syria and cavorted with terrorists and kidnappers and other vile enemies of civilization. Well, this time they tried it in Egypt, and McCain was shooting his mouth off about coups. He was told, get out and don't come back. You are persona non grata. There's an official statement on the Internet from the military-supported government, from the office of the president, I believe, where they say that Senator John McCain is henceforth persona non grata in Egypt. That's great. That's the kind of thing that clears the air like nobody's business. And, of course, he was there at the same time we had this State Department official who was trying to essentially save the Moslem Brotherhood. So the Egyptian government is more and more independent. And we have this is not a secret. Look at the Washington Post, for example, yesterday. Washington Post, Thursday, August 15th, 2013. U.S. criticism of the Egyptian events reflects fears of military rule. The U.S. fears the Egyptian army. The mentality of the Egyptian army right now, you'll recall, we covered it in detail last week. General Sisi's interview to the Washington Post in the first days of August, where Sisi said, you have turned your back on us, and we won't forget it. You can still redeem yourself, but we'll never forget what you've done to us, supporting Morsi, supporting terrorism, trying to stop the counter coup, and so forth. And as we read here in the Washington Post of August 15th, as wealthy Persian Gulf states interested in suppressing Islamist policies send billions of dollars to Egypt's military government, the relatively small amount of U.S. aid represents what officials say is the only financial and diplomatic leverage the administration can still bring to bear on Egypt. So there we are. And, of course, the U.S. is caught. They don't call it a coup. The Brotherhood freaks out. They don't support Sisi, and he has learned the lesson. Now, Sisi, of course, trained in the United States. That doesn't mean they bought him. It doesn't mean they brainwashed him. So the Egyptian presidency today issues the statement that Obama's bungling remarks on Martha's Vineyard of yesterday, Thursday, Obama's statement may embolden the armed groups. This is a way of saying, Obama, you encourage terrorism by holding out hope to the Moslem Brotherhood and their terrorist jihadi wing, which is what it is. So that's a pretty sharp rap. Obama supports terrorism, in effect, says the Egyptian government. And Obama has called off the Bright Star military exercises. I'm sure General Sisi is quaking in his boots that he won't be able to meet some U.S. generals. And, of course, they won't send the F-16s, 4 of them. So this is not very much. Now, there have been people killed. True. 700 this week, 100 or 200 since the coup, the counter coup. The coup was in June. The coup started on the 15th of June when Morsi cavorted with Qaradawi and the Salafists and the jihadis, right? The conference where Morsi declared jihad against Syria and broke diplomatic relations with Syria. That was the beginning of the coup. The counter coup came a couple of weeks later at the end of June when the army said, we're not going to be sent to fight Syria, we're not going to be sent to fight Ethiopia, and we're not going to sit here and wait for you to assassinate us, as has happened in some other countries. Maybe we can mention that, too. So there were 700 killed in Egypt this past week. There were 1,000 killed in Iraq in July and 4,000 since the beginning of the year. So get it in perspective, people. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley, Washington, D.C., August 16th, 2013. And we want to recall here the Washington Post article of yesterday on this points out The Obama administration's sharp criticism Wednesday of Egypt's ruling generals and their declared state of emergency reflects the rising American fear of prolonged military rule in the most populous Arab nation. Now, what are they afraid of? Are they afraid of the threat to democracy, or are they afraid that Egypt is escaping the imperialist yoke? I say this is anti-imperialism on the march in Egypt, national independence, national dignity. And I think this is now becoming a real revolution. There's real potential for an actual revolution. Up to now, this was, of course, a fraud. This was the destabilization of Mubarak, along with everybody else, unleashed by the CIA with the help of Assange, WikiLeaks, and the rest of these characters. Now, it's also clear from reports in the Washington Post and elsewhere, the United States repeatedly told the Egyptian generals, first of all, don't oust Morsi. That was Ambassador Patterson. She's now used up. She's now damaged goods. Get her out of there. They want to send in Ford. We say no. But just in the past week, the U.S. was repeatedly telling the Egyptian generals, don't you dare make a move to break up these camps, these fortified camps that have essentially blocked much of the business activity, the normal life of Cairo. You know, it's like saying we have the right to set up camp at the mixing bowl here, you know, the huge intersection of interstate highways near the Pentagon, right? We get to camp out there. No, and you'd see them swept away. Obviously, the clearing of Occupy deprives the United States of any possible basis for going through this stuff. So the U.S. tried to stop what is now happening, and not for humanitarian reasons. Now, El Baradei has dissociated himself from this. He has now quit as vice president. Good. He is a toady, a servant of the International Monetary Fund. And what Baradei says, you can be sure, reflects the thinking at the State Department and the European Union, right, with Baroness Ashton and the rest of these meddlers. There is now a clear radicalization inside Egypt. The vast majority of the Egyptian population supports the army. It includes the middle class. People were frightened by the obvious attempt of Morsi to consolidate a dictatorship. And the 1.5 billion will not do it. Egypt, and I have to stress this again, the Egyptian army is not, repeat, not run by the U.S., as so many ignorant people on Twitter and elsewhere seem to assume. Now, in terms of the details, this was a crackdown, right? There was plenty of warning, but there it went. The Moslem Brotherhood obviously had deployed snipers, right? There's something that looks like a third force intervening. You have the demonstrators, you have the army, and then you have people in civilian clothes who are shooting. And if you look on the Internet, you'll find plenty of tapes showing those snipers, right? And, of course, the Moslem Brotherhood is perfectly capable of shooting at the demonstrators, killing them in significant numbers, and then saying we're going to blame that on the army. Their cynicism is absolutely boundless when it comes to the struggle for power. This is the hallmark of the Moslem Brotherhood. It is this naive, impudent way of lying, right? This ice-cold lying where they don't seem to realize that nobody is going to believe it. You see a lot of people on TV talking like this. Now, Christian churches, 40, 50 Christian churches attacked, Copts being beat up in the streets, of course. But the main thing is the agent provocateur of the Muslim Brotherhood participate in the shooting. So don't say if it's 700 dead. It's a little bit like Syria. If there are 700 dead this week, that doesn't mean the army killed 700. That probably indicates something that's more like a rough parity in terms of who actually does the killing. The main thing is that the Brotherhood was preparing a dictatorship, and this was combined with the attack on Syria, coming out of that fateful June 15th mass rally in which Morsi broke diplomatic relations with Syria and called for an attack on Syria. You attack Syria, you're attacking Iran, you're attacking Hezbollah. Anybody who cares about the fate of political Islam in any good sense would be shocked by the treachery of Morsi turning against Syria. It used to be part of the same country under Nasserist auspices, right? That's the United Arab Republic, but he's going to wage war against Syria. Well, no. So that is part of it. There's also this question, if you let Morsi, if you're a general and you let Morsi set up this dictatorship, how long before you're executed? We can go back to the recent history of the Middle East and see examples where dictatorial governments have often then turned on the army. In a certain way, what's happening in Turkey is a version of that. More important, in Egypt today, there is no material basis for democracy. Democracy cannot be improvised in that sense. Democracy requires a solid basis in employment, standards of living. It requires a middle class which dominates the society. Needy people cannot be free, as Roosevelt wisely said. Necessitous people are not free people. If you are always on the verge of starvation, then it's impossible to exercise the judgment that you require from a voter in a democracy. Now, here's my hope, geopolitically. Given the impudence and insolence of the West, Obama, the European Union, I saw Hollande demands an immediate election. He demands it. Little Napoleon III, right? Tin Pot Hollande in Paris, right? Not realizing that, the Suez has been a long time ago, right? When France could invade Egypt in 1956 with the British and the Israelis and lose. The geopolitics, I'm hoping to see something that would be considered impossible by most of the ethnically oriented or even religiously oriented observers of the Middle East. I want to see a front of Egypt, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. That could pacify the Middle East. That would break this loathsome U.S.-British plan to have a Sunni front against the Shiite front and the Alawite front. That Shiite front would be Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and a few others. And then on the other side, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Turkey, and so forth. Break that pattern. Break it. Egypt, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, at least cooperating in a convergence, maybe not an alliance, but a convergence to do what? To survive, to develop economically, and to rebuff attempted destabilizations. That, I think, is the possibility. Now, the situation is fraught with peril. We cannot speak enough about the Suez Canal. The imperialists have their eyes on the Suez Canal. This is the big thing that the Egyptian military controls. The imperialists want it back. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. What is going on in Egypt is turning into an actual revolution after being a revolution in name only as hype. So look, in Iraq, 1,000 people killed in bombings, car bombs, suicide bombs primarily, in the month of July. This is largely Al-Qaeda types attacking Shiites, right? Al-Qaeda types attacking the Mahdi army and things like this. That's July. In Iraq, 4,000 dead in 2013. Of course, in Syria, it's more. So the Egyptian generals have essentially said, we must prevent this from coming to Egypt. The overflow of the Syrian death squads, in particular in the Sinai Peninsula, have shown the Egyptian generals that this cannot go on. As long as you had Morsi, you had a government that was essentially sympathetic to those death squads in the Sinai Peninsula, refused to move against them. We'll talk about this side of it in just a minute. So that's the reality. The only choice is, are you going to go down the path of total civil war, total destabilization with Morsi, or are you going to put a stop to this? Unfortunate, but there it is. And all the prating about democracy gets you absolutely nowhere. In Lebanon, we have a new group, the Brigades of Aisha, unheard of. They have put bombs into South Lebanon, South Beirut, the Hezbollah area. this is clearly a part of this same strategy. In other words, these are, with all probability, these are Al-Qaeda types, meaning extreme Sunnis, who are attacking Hezbollah. Concerning Hezbollah, Hezbollah now says that for the first time since 2006, this is Nasrallah speaking to Al-Mayadeen in Beirut, Hezbollah claims an attack on an Israeli convoy for the first time since the 2006 war, right? 7 years ago. Obviously a symptom of escalation. And then the problem that we've seen with the Suez Canal, right? The imperialists obviously covet this. They want it back. So there we have this situation in Egypt. The obvious pattern, and this is important, is that the so-called the liberals, right, the golden youth of Tahrir, now shorn of their illusions, I would think, gravitating towards the army, right? This Tamarod movement, the broad umbrella group, Tamarod, the rebel, which helped to overthrow Morsi, right, which got the people into the streets in large numbers, right? The estimates are now 27 million, 30 million, 33 million, I don't know, in the last week of June, and then in July, to come out and demonstrate against Morsi. So, but obviously a very, very large popular movement. The Tamarod is now largely on the side of the army. So that, I think, is it. Now, what we want to talk about later in the program is the question of economics. The Moslem Brotherhood is always talking about legitimacy. I propose the following. You need legitimacy, but there are different kinds. There is the purely formal legitimacy, which comes from formally observing all the rules of a so-called democratic process. This is process legitimacy, if you like. And we should remember that Mussolini and Hitler, at least for a while, operated strictly legally within the framework of democratic legitimacy, right? In 1933 for Hitler, Mussolini took longer to consolidate, but Mussolini largely, substantially, at least, whatever was going on outside, inside the parliament, this went by the various rules for quite a while. I reject the legitimacy of formalism. We need substantive legitimacy of content, of results. What could that be? Eudaimonic legitimation. Eudaimonic legitimation says that government is legitimate, which delivers the goods. The goods are economic progress, rising standards of living, full employment, economic development, cultural progress, the rising levels of education, progress in the healthcare system, increased longevity in the population, the possibility of sending people to advanced training over more years because they're going to have a much longer career, right? They're not going to be cut off by diseases like malaria and so forth in their youth. All of these things, right, the essential economic rights, a government that delivers those has a virtually unbeatable argument in terms of eudaimonic legitimation, the legitimacy of results, the legitimacy of progress, cultural and material progress for humanity. That is what government is there to promote. So this is what General Sisi needs to think of. And as I'm going to tell you in a little while, if we get to it now, I would say it's something like 5 million jobs in 6 months. 5 million jobs. And let's pick a figure. We'll refine these figures. But something like 4 million housing units. New homes, attractive, modern, good plumbing, sanitary, right? Airy, open, garden cities, whatever you want to have, whatever Egyptians like best. You've also got to think about an Autobahn, a super highway from these places like Port Said and Alexandria to Cairo and down the Nile, all the way to Khartoum in Sudan. And similarly, let's go back to the Cape to Cairo Railway, what the British imperialists talked about but never delivered. A lot of that goes through Egypt. So it starts in Cairo, right? It's the Cairo to Cape or Cape to Cairo Railway. Make a deal immediately with South Africa and all the other countries then along the route in between and build that railroad, right? There's a project of civil engineering. There are millions of jobs. The other one, of course, is you've got to have a superhighway that goes from, well, let's say, from Jerusalem all the way to Tripoli in Libya. It's got to go across the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. And then you've got to build in the rest of these areas. And those are the things that we need to think of right now. There's also, we'll talk a little bit more about irrigation in a minute. And of course, we got to talk about ways to finance this. But the immediate thing that General Sisi would need is the legitimation of economic results. Do things that are bold, that transform the daily life of the average Egyptian immediately. A shockwave of scientific, technological optimism going through this population. That's the most effective way to fight the obscurantism of the Moslem Brotherhood and their backward and prejudicial ways of approaching human affairs. Because that's the big thing with Morsi. He did not deliver. His campaign was, I will raise the living standards of the poor workers and the poor Falachin, the peasants of Egypt. And he didn't do it. Rather, he went and cavorted with the International Monetary Fund, if you please. He raised the sales tax. He promised that he would have a value-added tax. And he was trying to chip away at those subsidies. Those subsidies must remain. Under no circumstances can the subsidies be cut. They are a floor under the poorest people. We will need those subsidies for decades to come. And so this is now the future. In other words, the economic progress of Egypt, which becomes possible under these circumstances. So turn away from these questions of formal democracy, who did what to whom, right? Who demonstrated on what day and all this other stuff. 5 million new productive jobs. That's the bottom line. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now, we have much more to say about Egypt, Syria, and related questions. We've got to cover the fight against Robert Ford, who must not become U.S. ambassador to Cairo. I doubt he will. And we want to follow the Grand Mufti of Syria, my friend Dr. Hussein, inviting Pope Francis to come to Syria as a bringer of peace. But let's now shift our attention to the principal domestic struggle here in the United States, right? The transformation of U.S. politics that's starting in New York City with the magnificent effort, I would say, to build the Tax Wall Street Party. We want to thank all the listeners of this program who have come forward generously and given their kind support. And it is making a difference. And it looks like we have a fighting chance of going over the top. Right now it's the 16th as we're recording. By next Tuesday, I guess it is, that's going to be the 20th. That's where the rubber hits the road. Signatures have to go in. So we want to get the lowdown from Daniela Walls, who is... Can
you hear me, Webster?
Yes, we can. Daniela Walls, who's coordinating so much of these activities. What was the week like, Daniela? Tell us.
We have 3 days left to get the Tax Wall Street Party on this November ballot. If I sound a bit tired today, it's because I was up all night, or we were up all night counting signatures. The count at 5 a.m. this morning was 6,700 signatures.
Fantastic.
I know. I'm so happy, but I don't have the time to celebrate. Our minimum quota, if you guys remember, was 3,750, and our goal was 7,500. So we are now well past the minimum and right near our goal.
The goal is within reach.
Yes, and because things are going so well, we've now extended this goal to the largest amount of signatures possible. The higher the number we can turn in on the 20th, the more impossible it makes it for the city to challenge our signatures.
Right.
So this means we're going to have 3 days till Tuesday, August 20th, to collect as many as we possibly can.
A couple of days ago, we had 7 days to shake the world. Now we have 3 days to shake the world.
Yeah, we had 7 days to shake the world. What did we have? 4,500 when it was 70. When it was 7 days. Now it's 3 days. We've got 6,700. We're going to make this. We're just going to submit a really good number. The Tax Wall Street Party volunteer crew is going full time because of all the listener support on the streets in New York City. We have members out there from the United Front Against Austerity, and listeners from your show, like you said, have stepped forward. My God, it's been amazing.
Daniela, apropos, why don't you give the phone numbers and emails and so forth? We give them now, then we can repeat them at the end of your visit.
Yeah. Okay. So, of course, we can still use volunteers now, even though there's 3 days left. So if you can join us, call me immediately at 310-926-1584, or our petition team leader at Airstrip 1, Chris Reith, at 908-433-3266. We call his cell phone Airstrip 1. But the silver bullet now are donations. We still need to supplement our volunteers with as many paid petitioners as we can possibly afford. We have a long line of petitioners willing and ready to work. At the moment, we can pay them. So for every $80 that comes in, that's a full day's work for a professional, and they're really good. We also are going to need to pay our lawyer to help us bundle these signatures and make sure that everything that is submitted is done by the book and is absolutely perfect. So we have been setting aside money for that, but we could still use some more because we don't have the total to pay them. We have 3 days left. So anything you can give us now will ensure that this is a reality and launch our new alternative American political party, the Tax Wall Street Party. So you can donate at credico2013.org/donate, or there is a donate button that's easy to find right on the homepage of the website, Credico, CREDICO 2013.org, credico2013.org, and help us out. So that's all the nuts and bolts right now that I have.
All right, now Daniela, this week we had the order coming from the federal judge on stop and frisk, and we know that Randy Credico is the only one of these candidates who has had an actual watertight, ironclad position, no stop and frisk. We know that the rest of them have weasel words, right? They play word games.
Well, there's a lot of doublespeak going on, isn't there? Especially, the spotlight's on de Blasio this week, and the double speak is hard to detect. You almost have to become a professional at trying to find this stuff. Like, for instance, in these debates about if we're going to talk about stop and frisk, on Tuesday there were the ABC debates, and de Blasio says in his opening statement, "I will end the era of stop and frisk." So he uses the word era and also the word end. I will end the stop and frisk era that has unfairly targeted people of color. So he manipulatively throws the word end in there to confuse the listeners, but doesn't say that he will end stop and frisk, but that he will end the stop and frisk era. Well, thanks a lot, de Blasio.
Just to point this out, he's lying because, in effect, remember, a lie is the intent to deceive. And by that standard, he is lying in the sense that not de Blasio, not Quinn, none of them say we will end it. They what they really say is we will keep stop and frisk without the abuses.
Yeah, in this corporate TV debate on ABC, I thought the best one of the six of the vetted candidates was Lou. Lou was the only one actually saying anything or something close to something. Lou is saying he will end stop and frisk, and Lou made a good point when he said, We don't need to amend stop and frisk. We need to end stop and frisk. But the rest of them, there's so much doublespeak going on. Like Bill de Blasio says that he will make health care more accessible, where Randy says,
I
thought I lost you because my phone. I'm on a terrible cell phone.
That's fine.
Going
but
in and out.
Credico says he's going to make it free for everybody as a right.
Capital F, free as a right. End of story. Why does there always, Webster, like this never-ending middle area, like more accessible? Nothing ever really means anything. Double
talk. These are the double talk candidates. And look,
then it says, like, George Packer, I was reading this article in the New Yorker a little while ago, and he said that he's thrilled that de Blasio is going to make New Yorkers think about inequality. Notice he doesn't use the word do. He's thrilled that, like, they're going to think. Like, so what's de Blasio actually going to do about inequality? And I guess one answer would be his newfangled pre-K tax, but versus Randy's Wall Street sales tax, this is just a very tiny tax on people, I think, over $500,000 paid for what he calls universal pre-K, but it's a drop in the bucket given all the city needs.
Right, and I think this actually explains why de Blasio shows up with some traction. The polls put de Blasio first this week. He has a pre-K tax, which he says is going to be something like 4% for people over $500,000, or is it $1 million in income? Nothing. It's peanuts. It's chicken feed. Yeah. It's a token. And if you compare the amount of revenue you get with Credico's Wall Street sales tax, it's out of all proportion. In other words, Credico wins hands down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously. I would say that much more than, like, the sudden burst in the polls. There's also this sudden burst of love. Like,
right.
It's coming from the new. I can only give you examples. I have an entire black composition book filled this week with notes of stuff I've been observing about this peculiar campaign. But the New York Republic magazine just had a big article on de Blasio titled "New Yorkers Have Fallen in Love with a Mayoral Candidate." New York Magazine titled an article, "The Gray Lady Has a Crush on Gangly Liberal Bill de Blasio," the Gray Lady being the New York Times. So there seems to be a lot of love in the air, and maybe, like, we should ask where all this love is coming from. Because
I can propose one thing.
Can you
Soros.
Tell me?
George Soros. The pockets of George Soros, the billionaire predator.
Soros came forward.
Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. We're getting an update on the fight to get the Wall Street sales tax implemented in New York City. The first step is the Tax Wall Street Party being on the ballot in the November election, November 5th. Randy Credico, already running on the Wall Street sales tax, is on the ballot for the Democratic primary September 10th. So we're getting down to the stretch on the Democratic primary side. What I think we saw this week, Daniela, and it was also pointed out by Credico, one of his statements, the attempt of all this stuff is Soros is supporting de Blasio, the Soros media, as you say, the New Republic, right. New York Magazine, New York Times, Huffington, The Nation, Vanden Heuvel, that crowd, right?
The whole crew, the same cast of characters. When Soros came out and officially endorsed de Blasio, I said, oh, no, because I've seen this George Soros movie before, and it's not pretty. He's the infiltrator of U.S. movements like Occupy and Move On, and, like, he represents, like you said, the left wing of Wall Street. So this means that de Blasio is a Wall Street guy. Bloomberg, you may have said this, represents the right wing of Wall Street, and Soros the left wing, but it's all Wall Street.
So the choice for New Yorkers would be Quinn. Quinn of the city council is the clone of Bloomberg, and then de Blasio, the clone of Soros. So you're supposed to choose between them.
The mouthpiece of Soros, yeah. My experience with Soros is when I watched his companies infiltrate the Occupy movement, and he skillfully redirected the energy away from Wall Street crimes and bank crimes and the Federal Reserve crimes to make it about police brutality and the amorphous corporation or the amorphous tax the rich, just like he's doing now, taking the attention away from the Wall Street sales tax to this pre-K tax. This small tax makes it seem to the average viewer like de Blasio is going after the big guys on Wall Street, but it's a piddling nothing tax for a small program, and it's a giant distraction from Randy's Wall Street sales tax. And everything the Wall Street sales tax could fund, like free health care for all, free city college, free transportation, an FDR-style infrastructure jobs program to rebuild all that aging infrastructure in New York. And Randy will throw in pre-K. Randy will also certainly include pre-K in his comprehensive education project. But to get all this, you need to tax Wall Street, and de Blasio is not going to touch Wall Street.
Right.
That's what I have to say about that. And then,
right. Again, things like City College being for free as it used to be. Get back to that. There's also this question about fair treatment of the city unions, right? The public unions. With Bloomberg, we have 150 some odd unions that do business with the city or employees, and none of them has a contract. And it's sort of union busting.
Isn't there a backlog or of a bunch of pay that's owed to the union workers?
There's $8 billion in retroactive pay that is owed to city workers, and none of these candidates is pro-labor, right? Oh, we're told that de Blasio is the progressive insurrection hero, right? He's the new hope for the progressive. How about some pro-labor?
He has $11.99 the healthcare workers now, but he almost has no union support. And you've got to ask yourself, if there's this big populist insurgent candidate, why does he have no union support? Must be to me because the unions have been dealing with him.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure thing.
I have a little bit of inside information about some weird things that are going on in his campaign office, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I thought about this Soros connection a while ago before this came out, because there's some really weird things going on with de Blasio's staff. For example, we all know that Soros helped put Obama in the White House in a big way, and now all these same key people from Obama's campaigns are showing up in de Blasio's city public advocate's office and campaign. He's made them all into city workers. De Blasio's campaign manager is Bill Hires. Hires was the state director of the president's 2012 and 2008 campaigns. Then de Blasio is also giving key city positions in his public advocate's office to a lot of political operatives from the White House. And the key question that I'm asking is, have these appointees been doing city public advocates work, or have they been doing political work? There's a guy named Dominic Williams is his chief of staff in the New York City Public Advocate's Office now, and Williams was an associate policy director for state and local issues for the Obama campaign. This hasn't been reported by the New York media at all, and also, de Blasio has been quietly benefiting from all the Soros and Obama campaign network.
Let me just add on this. If people can remember Gary Hartpence transforming himself into Gary Hart and stuff like this, right? Herbert Fromm became Willy Brandt in Europe. In this case, it's Warren Wilhelm. De Blasio's real name is Warren Wilhelm. He changed his name, I would say, for political reasons, so that he could come on as a big ethnic Italian, I guess, but he's not. He's Warren Wilhelm.
So Wilhelm might sound like a German Kaiser. And so I think shouldn't that signify that this making of his image into like what we see now, this kind of Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, with a little Dickens thrown in. You know what I'm saying? It's like this that's all coming out of Madison Avenue, but it has been in the works. Like, it's been a long time in the crafting.
Right. I think the danger is with this guy de Blasio, people are setting themselves up for tragic disappointments, and they've got to take a look at Credico, who has these programmatic points that are real. In other words, those are real commitments. With de Blasio, it's all double talk, weasel words, word games, fakery, and so forth. And then he's got this entire radical chic crowd with him.
People are going to have to make the extra effort to find out about Credico now, because the Soros marketing leviathan is a tough match. Because at the Credico campaign, mostly we only have the alternative media on our side. These television debates and forums are all owned by corporations, and they're making it impossible to get Randy a spot into these debates. They're shutting us out. The rationale that these networks are giving me for not letting Randy into the debates is that even though he was legally nominated by the people, is that you have to have gotten at least $50,000 in donations and poll 2% in the Quinnipiac polls. But that would be impossible for Randy to pull 2%, since Randy's name was not included. It was omitted in the Quinnipiac
Right, so it's like a catch-22 circular argument.
How can they do that? All
right, Daniela, we're fed up. We want to do something. How do we get into action once again? Tell us the contact.
Okay. you can, if you want to volunteer, call me at 310-926-1584. Our petition team leader and the guys out on the street. If you're immediately in New York, you want to get out on the streets right now, call Chris Reith at 908-433-3266. And also, again, like I said before, the silver bullet is donations. We are, if whatever you can donate, we need to supplement our volunteers with paid petitioners and pay our lawyers so that everything is done exactly perfect and exactly right. So we have 3 days left. So anything that you can do it now. It will ensure that this project is a reality. You can donate at credico2013.org/donate. Or there is a donate button that is easy to find right on the homepage of the website, credico2013.org, CREDICO 2013.org, or email me at taxwallstreetparty@gmail, TAXWallstreetparty@gmail, or you can also look at the Tax Wall Street Party website at taxwallstreetparty.org. That's it, Webster.
Okay, and any events coming up? What does it look like?
Yeah, I do have an event because let me find it. It's in my notes. The exact it has the address. Hold on.
Take your time.
Okay.
Because it's got an active campaign.
I know. I can't even think straight about anything. Randy, this is the LGBTQ people have stepped forward.
Quickly.
Is that a break?
That's a break. We've got to say goodbye. Anyway, check the website. Check the Credico website, and you'll find all the details where the candidate will be. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So that's Credico2013.org. You can find his appearance. Credico invited to be part of a candidates' night at the LGBT organization in the city. Check Credico 2013 and you will find it. Now, back to Egypt and Syria. Let me just point out the Grand Mufti of Syria, the Grand Mufti of Syria and of Damascus, this is Dr. Hussein, has invited Pope Francis I, the Roman Pontiff, to come to Syria as the bringer of peace. Make a pilgrimage of peace, says the Grand Mufti of Syria. Now, I would point out the Grand Mufti of Syria is an extraordinary person. He is precisely the kind of inclusive, irenic, conciliatory approach to religion that the world needs. His own son was assassinated. He has publicly renounced any quest for revenge against the killers. He has actually stirred up a lot of the ulema, right, the religious scholars, with his, I think, modern and conciliatory, inclusive readings of the traditional religious ideas of Islam. This is an exemplary person in many ways. He's also quite tough. Huh? He also warned people, don't attack Syria or you will find all kinds of bad things breaking out around you. So he's not a softy, but this is the precise combination we need. So the Grand Mufti of Syria invites the Pope to come to Syria as pilgrim of peace. Now, I had put out the same thing, maybe you remember, after my visit to Syria, when I met the Grand Mufti of Syria. We didn't talk about this specifically, but on the way back, it occurred to me that it would be time for, at that point, Benedict XVI to make a pilgrimage to Syria. And the way I thought of it was the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, had just been in Syria and Lebanon. He had made a visit to the Orthodox and others, and all kinds of people in Syria and Lebanon. So if the Patriarch of Moscow can go, then the Roman Pope can certainly go. So here we are back to this now, I think maybe more promising. I hope Pope Francis, right, who washed the feet of the Muslim woman prisoner there in Rome on Maundy Thursday, and he went then to Lampedusa to minister to the people coming over, the boat people coming from Tunisia and Libya. This is something that the Roman Holy See should, it seems to me, accomplish, right, to stand up for peace in that way. Now, on the other side, you get people like Qaradawi. Qaradawi is the incendiary cleric on Al Jazeera Arabic. He doesn't get on Al Jazeera English. I don't think we'll be seeing Qaradawi on the new Al Jazeera current TV, right? No, we won't get that part of it because this is, essentially the benighted side of things. Qaradawi has done three things, right? Qaradawi was part of that meeting on June 15th, along with Morsi, where the big chant was jihad against Syria, break diplomatic relations between Egypt and Syria. That was June 15th. Now, since the counter-coup, Qaradawi is calling for jihad against Egypt. He's calling for foreign fighters to come to Egypt. Bad news. And Qaradawi has a statement out saying that if the Prophet Muhammad were alive today, he would be an ally of NATO. Unbelievable. An ally of NATO. That's Qaradawi. So that's the kind of people that were gravitating to Morsi, as well as that terrorist governor that he put in at Luxor in Upper Egypt, right, the Valley of the Kings and so forth. That's where he installed this guy who had been the head of the group that killed 60 or 70 foreign tourists back in the late 90s. And then above all, this question of the emirate, the Islamic emirate of the Sinai or the North Sinai, right? Complete, written, engraved invitation to the imperialists to come on in. Now, let's look at the economic program. As we're saying, formal legitimacy is okay if you can get it, right? It means more in a country like the U.S., where these mechanisms have been going, right? The formalism has stood up for 230 or 240 years. Fine. In a country like Egypt, where they're making the Constitution up as you go along, right? Where the Constitution comes after the president was put in, and the president essentially rewrites his own Constitution, that formal legitimacy doesn't mean that much. But the substantive legitimation, in other words, can you deliver a positive future for the Egyptian people? Can you give them a perspective in the world? And this means economic development above all. So let's divide it into two sides. We need to stabilize the new government through heavy-duty economic achievements. I would say 5 million jobs. Now, let's see about this. The current unemployment officially, at the most recent month that I've been able to find for Egypt, is about 3.5 million, let's say 3.5 million, which is reckoned to be 12.6% of the workforce. Women especially hard hit, 24% of women unemployed, 9.2% of men. Now, this is a very low-ball estimate because it imagines that out of 90 million Egyptians, the workforce is less than 20 million, fewer than 20 million. That can't be right. But I would just say, given that we're operating in an area where statistics are maybe not so reliable, let's start with a nice round number. Maybe 5 million jobs is what we need. Maybe it's 7 million. It might be 10 million. But let's get something along these lines, and we can fine-tune the numbers as we go. Remember, this is political economy. This is Leibniz, by the way. When Leibniz went to Peter the Great in Russia, he didn't organize a democracy movement to overthrow Peter the Great. He worked with Peter the Great to create the Russian Academy of Sciences and bring economic development and modernization, without which democracy and other such refinements are simply impossible. Similarly today, if you're a young person, don't worry about overthrowing governments for the moment. Let's worry about developing these societies to the point where stable democracies become possible. And you're seeing, even in the Western world, right, once the economic situation begins to collapse, then even long-standing democracies come under pressure from coups. We've seen a couple here in the U.S. in the past few years, right? Some coups occur when the economic engine begins to break down or has broken down. So, say 5 million jobs, productive jobs. These are high capital intensity, high energy intensity, high tech, and so forth. Now, we then need to distinguish between the employment which depends on domestic inputs, and the jobs for which you need international input. We'll treat this in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. So let's outline some ideas, and I naturally invite contributions, any kind of help people want to give, especially first-person expertise and so forth. Something like 5 million jobs minimum, say within 6 months. 3 to 4 million new housing units, right? You multiply that by 3 to 4 to 5, depending on the size of the Egyptian family. You've done something for a significant part of the population. This is exactly where Morsi never had any ideas, right? Because the Moslem Brotherhood is interested in their own moneyed interest, right? Not in raising the mass standard of living. You've got to do the infrastructure, right? You look at Egypt, it's more or less the point at which Africa turns into Asia. It's a tremendous hub. If you're going to have traffic coming by land from Africa, it's going to go through Egypt and then into nearby Asia. It's going to go into Palestine, into Israel, and so forth, and therefore into Asia and indeed around into Europe. So it is kind of the hub of that Afro-Eurasian landmass. So infrastructure is absolutely key, and that would mean start the Cape to Cairo railway, start in Cairo and go south, do the railway, start the Maghreb line from Cairo going towards Libya, and then start the Afro-Asian block line going from Cairo, and of course that means Alexandria, Port Said, Suez, and so forth, and get that going across into towards Jerusalem, towards Amman, towards Damascus, and so forth, right? And then another line going south into Saudi Arabia. So that's some idea. And of course, you've got to have superhighways that do the same thing. You do want to work on making the Nile navigable, because you want to have that device where you hook the Nile up with the Congo, right? There's a place where they're very close, way up outside of Egypt, right? And I guess it's even south of Sudan, right? But somewhere in that lake district, the two rivers get very, very close. So let's look at it. In terms of your in-country inputs, your in-country inputs would be for construction, for building highways in particular, and for building housing. It is probably the case that Egypt already has all the in-country inputs that they need. They certainly have labor, right? They've got a huge pool of unemployed, unskilled, and semi-skilled workers. Those can be usefully employed, tremendous benefits in building road infrastructure, public housing, and other public buildings. And probably the cement, steel, other elements necessary for building, that's probably all available in country. Now, what you do there is very simple. Seize control of the central bank, nationalize the central bank, deprivatize it, and they start putting out Egyptian pounds at 0% interest to buy, let's say, bonds issued by provincial governors, or by, if we want to do a more centralized version, maybe more like Egypt, the new Cape to Cairo Railroad Authority and the new Cape to Cairo superhighway puts out bonds which are then bought. Those are 0%, zero coupon, 100-year bonds, and those are bought by the Egyptian National Bank, the nationalized central bank. You have no problems with that. You can put out credit without limit because all of your inputs are in country. Now, there are other things, though, you have to do where you got to get modern capital goods. Those have to be imported. And when it comes to imported inputs, high-quality modern capital goods, now you got to get some help, because now you got to get import financing, right? You can't just print Egyptian pounds. That won't work. The BRICS. Our dear friends, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have talked about this BRICS bank, the alternative to the International Monetary Fund. Obviously, Egypt cannot survive with the IMF. Egypt must kick the IMF out. And as far as I can see, Sisi and company have taken the first steps towards doing that. Kick the IMF out, throw away their rule book, kick out Baradei, this Musa, if he's on that same line, get rid of anybody who speaks in favor of the IMF. and get actual competent political economy going, you've got to get a significant loan from the BRICS Bank. I would say to the BRICS Bank, it's time to make your move now. The BRICS Bank must act to save Egypt from chaos and economic collapse, right? Egypt is the biggest grain importer as it is right now. It cannot finance its own food consumption. This has got to be changed, and fast. Now, there is a cushion. We have the $12 billion that Sisi has gotten from the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Emirates, who are scared. So they're willing to pay that. At least those are pledges. Now, whether that money has come in or not, I don't know. They say the U.S. contribution for this year has already been paid. So don't worry about them. The U.S. is okay until next April or so. By that time, much of this stuff will have died down, right? All kinds of things will happen in the meantime. But right now, the BRICS Bank was supposed to be $250 billion. And then they said, oh, that's too much. We're going to cut it down to $50 billion U.S. dollars. You would need, I would say, $25 billion as a loan to Egypt. But you don't even necessarily send the cash to Egypt. This is to pay the foreign manufacturers of high-quality capital goods, high-speed electric locomotives, machinery for road building, machinery for canal building, and similar things. And I have to say, high-temperature, pebble bed, fourth generation, super safe, super productive nuclear reactors. Yes, indeedy. Everybody else wants them. Iran wants them. It's the badge of independence. It's the substance of independence. They have the sense to want them. Green pessimists in the West don't like it. Sorry, right? That's just too bad. Egypt is not going to be interested in what Western public opinion thinks. Now, the grain question, irrigation. This has always been the big thing. You have the Nile, and along the Nile is a relatively narrow strip of green, right? You see this if you fly from Cairo to Khartoum and back. You'll see it, the Nile. And then you have the Aswan Dam. Above that, you have Lake Nasser. It goes on for hundreds of miles. This is all tremendous. But this has got to be expanded. And the traditional ideas have been the second Nile. Take the Nile at some point in its course and build a second branch of the Nile that would go off to the left, that would go off to the west, and would meet the Mediterranean, say, halfway between Alexandria and the Libyan border, something like that, to broaden this effect. So then you'd have another green strip along that second Nile. Problem there is the Qattara Depression. When Field Marshal Montgomery stopped Rommel at El Alamein outside Cairo, he was able to fortify a line and hold it because his southern flank was held by the Qattara Depression. Rommel's tanks couldn't get through the Qattara Depression. And this is a problem, right? Can the second Nile go through the Qattara Depression? And the famous salt domes. There are salt domes in that desert. If you send a stream of fresh water into the desert, you got to somehow deal with the fact that you're going to run into these salt domes, and the salt domes then will make it into brackish salt water, and it will not be usable then downstream from that for any kind of irrigation. Now, people in the circle around Mubarak, a guy called Kamal, you remember him, from early 2011, had plans for 20 million acres of irrigated land. This is sort of how we have to do it. We got to think big. Egypt should become self-sustaining in food within a couple of years, and it can be done. And that is, I think, one of the goals of the program. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, the question of irrigation, right? The second Nile, defeating the Qattara Depression, defeating the salt domes, what to do about this? My guess is that Egypt already has steel mills or something like this, and if you have even a pilot project, you can then expand that quite rapidly. The infrastructure is clear, right? That this hub, the area between Egypt and Palestine, is essentially the point, again, where Africa and Asia meet, and that is going to become a huge transshipment entrepot area. You got to have warehouses. You got your fast rail, your maglev rail going through there, and so forth, right? The widening of the Suez Canal, second Suez Canal, these are all interesting projects, too. So the big thing is break with the IMF, make a direct appeal to the BRICS, right? The BRICS have got to act now. The BRICS have been acting as if they had all the time in the world. They do not. Once you say you're going to create an institution which is an alternative to the IMF, then you better get busy, because at that point the IMF is coming after you. So there is an urgency involved in this, which has to be brought home to the BRICS. So the great debut of the BRICS Bank on the world stage as an alternative to the IMF must be Egypt, and it has to happen now in 2013, in the next 6 months. Now, just a couple of other notes. We've done Karadawi. On Michael Hastings, the U.S. journalist who died mysteriously, there's an attempt now to shift the emphasis on Hastings from Petraeus to Brennan. There's a dodge. He was investigating Petraeus, not Brennan. And it's not more radical to attack Brennan. It's more radical to attack Petraeus, because that's the mastermind of the coup. And we're living in a time of coups. Assange tells us that he loves Rand Paul and Ron Paul. The libertarians are the only hope to the United States. And Assange, little Lord Julian, supports WikiLeaks, but he mainly supports Rand Paul and Ron Paul because they're nice to WikiLeaks. You can take a look, if you want to see some chronicles of real sleaze. Look at Jesse Benton, the Ron Paul campaign honcho and the husband of Ron Paul's granddaughter. He said in the past couple of weeks that he's holding his nose while working for Mitch McConnell. But what it means is that the Ron Paul, Rand Paul machine, in the same way that they endorsed Romney for the presidency and ran as the right-wing border guard wingman for Romney to get Romney the Republican nomination to keep Santorum out on the right, they're willing to engage in all sorts of unprincipled deals, right? Deals with the neocons, in this case, deals with McConnell, this is supposedly a rhino. We're hearing rhino now from the libertarians. They're talking more and more like the Republicans that they are. So Jesse Benton is holding his nose. The rest of us don't have to do that, so we don't have to support Ron Paul and Rand Paul. We don't want to jostle elbows with Assange in the cheering team for Ron Paul and Rand Paul. Now, Russia, the Russian campaign goes on. The attempts to slander Russia are proliferating. We are doing something different. It is now very likely that here in Washington, D.C., we will have an event on the day the Russian fleet arrived in New York City. The anniversary is the 24th of September, and it looks increasingly likely, like here in Washington, D.C., at the very least, we will have an event to commemorate this geopolitical landmark in the history of the world, the intervention of the Russian Empire into the American Civil War on the side of the Union, which effectively blocked Lord John Russell and his demonic plan with Napoleon III for a British-French intervention in the Civil War on the side of the slavocrats, the slave power conspiracy in Richmond. So we need, of course, to take this commemoration to New York City, to San Francisco, and to Boston. In San Francisco, it's on October 12th. Patriots and friends of the United States and Russia in the Bay Area, October 12th is a day worth remembering. In New York City, it's September 24th. But, of course, the fleet there stayed for quite a while, and there was the parade was in at the end of September, beginning of October was the big parade on Broadway, and in Boston, ships from the Russian fleet arrived in Boston, and of course they did arrive here in Washington D.C., although that came a bit later. So the visits include New York, San Francisco, Boston, and Washington, and it's confirmed the Russian admiral was prepared to defend San Francisco under his sealed orders. He was going to defend San Francisco against rumored attacks by Confederate commerce raiders, be it the Sumter, the Shenandoah, or other Confederate raiders. So this reminds us of this bedrock, right? When I think I've said before, when you do this research, you'll find people like Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy of the United States in the Lincoln cabinet, saying, God bless the Russians, right? The only assistance. Oliver Wendell Holmes writes that famous poem, we remember who was our friend when the world was our foe, when just about everybody was against the Union. Russia stood strong, and the tendency, of course, it goes back to Catherine the Great and Panin, the League of Armed Neutrality, helping the American Revolution, assistance rendered by Russia to the United States in the War of 1812 to get the British to finally sign the peace treaty. During the Crimean War, the United States correctly, at least patriotic elements said, that if the British and the French can crush Russia, the United States would be next in that mad rampage of imperialism, the high point of the British Empire between 1850 and 1870 or so. The Second World War. General George Marshall, not my favorite guy, but still the top military man of the U.S. Army, pointed out the United States will owe an eternal debt of gratitude to Russia for this great military achievement, the defense of the Soviet Union and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Eternal, my friends, means eternal. And I'm not just talking sentimentalism. I'm talking things that are rooted in actual shared interests, if properly understood. If you get rid of Wall Street domination, you find a very clear convergence between Russia and the United States. The reason this is obscured is because of this outrageous domination of American life by bankers. And interesting, the testimony of Wharton Barker, an American banker who was a financial agent for the Russian Empire, and he had a conversation with Tsar Alexander II, right? Tsar Alexander II, who freed the serfs, and like Lincoln, fell victim to a British-inspired assassination plot. In the case of Alexander II, it was the Russian anarchists run from London. Tsar Alexander II pointed out to Wharton Barker that when the British and the French invited him to take part in an attack on the United States, he warned them in advance, if you make this proposal to me, I will take that as casus belli. That will start a world war. And I will put myself on the side of the United States, and just to prove that I'm not bluffing, I'm sending my fleet. So that was done in the autumn, November of 1862, and what with the ice conditions and everything, those fleets then arrived with various delays in September of 1863, right after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and the Russian fleets, those are the great events of 1863. We'll commemorate them. Save the date. 24th of September here in Washington, D.C. Get ready to see you there. And we'll be back next week on World Crisis Radio.